My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government's priority has always been to secure the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union.
In the final weeks of her life, Queen Elizabeth made time for a conversation that the people who arranged it understood immediately was not an ordinary conversation. Not because of who it was with. The person she spoke to had access to her regularly in those final weeks, had been part of her trusted inner circle for long enough that the specific protocols of royal access had long since relaxed into something closer to genuine private relationship, because of what Elizabeth asked to speak about. She asked specifically and deliberately to speak about Camilla, not about Charles, not about William, not about the succession or the institution, or any of the formal subjects that the final weeks of a 70-year reign might be expected to generate conversations about Camilla. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. The person she spoke to has never publicly disclosed what was said. They have maintained the specific silence that Elizabeth trusted them to maintain when she chose them for this specific conversation rather than someone else. But the decisions that have been made inside the British monarchy in the years since Elizabeth's death reflect the specific guidance she gave in that final conversation in ways that are only now becoming visible to anyone watching closely enough. The duchy decisions, the Clause 7 document, the Tuesday meeting, Anne's letter, the quiet redistribution of patronages and ceremonial authority, the specific shape of everything that has happened to Camilla's position since the autumn of Elizabeth's death. All of it traces back to a conversation in the final weeks of Elizabeth's life that she arranged specifically and deliberately, and that lasted nearly an hour. This is what was said in that conversation, and why it has been the quiet foundation of everything that has happened since. Before we go any further, if you are new to Palace Drop, subscribe now and hit the bell. We cover the royal family the way it actually happens, not the managed version. The human story underneath all of it. Queen Elizabeth's final private conversation about Camilla is the story that connects everything your channel has been covering, and today we map it completely. Stay with us. To understand why Elizabeth arranged this specific conversation in the final weeks of her life, you need to understand something about how Elizabeth operated that the public version of her character only partially captures. Elizabeth did not leave things to chance. Across 70 years of reign, she had demonstrated a consistent pattern of preparing the ground for outcomes she believed were necessary before those outcomes became urgent. She had managed transitions of personnel, of policy, of institutional direction, with the specific patience and the specific deliberateness of someone who understood that the most important decisions are made well before the moment of crisis, rather than in response to it. She had applied this same deliberateness to the question of Camilla's position in the monarchy she was leaving behind. Not recently. From the moment it became clear that Charles and Camilla's relationship was going to be the defining personal fact of Charles's adult life, Elizabeth had been thinking about what that meant for the institution in the long term, rather than simply in the immediate term. Her public management of that question across the years of rehabilitation had been careful and deliberate, and largely successful in the operational sense. The public had moved from the initial hostility toward Camilla that followed Diana's death through a gradual, if never complete, acceptance of her as Charles's partner and eventually as his wife. The coronation had proceeded without the significant public disruption that some had predicted. The rehabilitation had reached the point that the palace had been working toward for nearly 2 decades. But Elizabeth's private assessment of what the rehabilitation had achieved and what it had not achieved were not the same as the public management of it suggested. She had never confused the success of the rehabilitation process with a resolution of the underlying questions that the rehabilitation had been designed to manage, rather than answer. The questions were still there. About what Camilla's position in the institution, after Charles was genuinely right, and genuinely sustainable rather than simply politically managed. About what the institution's honest accounting of its own past required in terms of how Camilla's future was handled. about what Elizabeth owed Diana's memory in the decisions she made about the person most associated with Diana's suffering. She had been holding those questions privately for decades. In the final weeks of her life, she decided they needed to be answered in a form that would outlast her, not in a document, not in a formal instruction that would become part of the institutional record and that would constrain her successors in ways that formal instructions constrain. In a conversation with a person she trusted, whose understanding of what she said and whose judgment about how to use that understanding she believed was equal to the weight of what she was going to say. She arranged the conversation. Drop in the comments right now where you are watching from, country or city below. We want to know where the Palace Drop community is based. Drop it below and stay with us, because who Elizabeth chose for this conversation and why she chose that specific person rather than any of the more obvious candidates is the detail that tells you everything about how seriously she took what she was going to say. Elizabeth did not choose a family member for this conversation. She did not choose Charles. What she needed to say was about his wife and his reign and the specific challenges that the combination of those two things created for the institution he was inheriting. A conversation with Charles about Camilla would have required her to manage his feelings about what she said while she was saying it, and Elizabeth, in the final weeks of her life, did not have the energy for that management, on top of everything else she was managing. She did not choose William. William was the ultimate recipient of the guidance she intended to give, but giving it to him directly in this specific form would have placed obligations on him that she was not certain were fair to place on a man who was already carrying the weight of everything he understood about the future he was inheriting. She did not choose Anne. Anne already knew what Elizabeth thought about Camilla in the general terms that decades of close observation had produced. What Elizabeth needed was not someone who already knew. She needed someone who would transmit accurately and without the specific filter of their own history with the subject. She chose the person she chose because of a quality that Elizabeth had valued above almost any other quality in the people around her across 70 years of reign. Discretion combined with judgment. Not simply the ability to keep a secret, the ability to understand what a secret was for, and to use it in service of the purpose it was intended to serve, rather than simply maintaining it indefinitely as an undischarged obligation. The person she chose had demonstrated that combination across years of trusted service in Elizabeth's inner circle. They had been given things to know and things to do that had required both qualities simultaneously, and they had demonstrated both without deviation. Elizabeth trusted them. And in the final weeks of a 70-year reign, during which she had trusted very few people with the things that mattered most, that trust was specific and meaningful and not extended casually. She asked them to come. They came. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Elizabeth began the conversation not with Camilla but with Diana. The people familiar with the account of that hour described this as significant because Elizabeth, across the public years of her reign, had been extraordinarily careful about what she said about Diana in any context that could reach beyond the immediate private conversation. She had managed her public statements about Diana with the precision of someone who understood that every word she said about her former daughter-in-law would be weighed against Diana's own account of her experiences in ways that could damage either Elizabeth or the institution if she was not careful. In private, she had been more candid, but even in private, she had maintained a specific carefulness that reflected her awareness of the weight of what she said and the potential reach of where it went. In this conversation in the final weeks of her life, that carefulness was different, not absent. Elizabeth was never without some form of carefulness about consequential things, but different in the specific way that people who know they are running out of time become different. Less concerned with the management of perception, more concerned with the honest transmission of what they actually believed. She told the person she had chosen something about Diana that she had not said in those specific terms to anyone before. She said that she had not understood Diana when she needed to understand her, not in the accusatory sense that the simplest reading of that statement might produce. not as a confession of cruelty or indifference or deliberate failure, in the more complicated, honest sense that Elizabeth had spent decades reaching. She had not understood what Diana needed from the institution, because the institution she led did not have a framework for what Diana needed. It had frameworks for managing public presentation and constitutional function and ceremonial requirement. It did not have frameworks for the specific kind of person Diana was and the specific kind of support that person required to function within the demands the role placed on her. The frameworks were not adequate. She had understood this only gradually, and had understood it completely only in hindsight, in the years after Diana's death, when the evidence of what Diana had experienced became public in ways that Elizabeth could not have fully anticipated from inside the institution's own management of it. She said this to the person she had chosen, in the specific tone that the people familiar with the account of that hour describe as the most personal and least managed thing they had ever heard Elizabeth say about anything. Then she said that everything she was about to say about Camilla needed to be understood in the context of that admission. Elizabeth did not speak about Camilla with hostility. The people familiar with the account of that conversation are consistent and clear about this. Whatever the complexity of Elizabeth's private feelings about Camilla across the decades, the tone she brought to the conversation in the final weeks of her life was not hostile. It was honest in the way that things are honest when the person saying them has moved beyond the need to manage the impression they create and is simply saying what they actually believe. She said that Camilla was not the person the simplest version of the public narrative made her, not the villain of Diana's story in the uncomplicated sense that the public had always been most comfortable with. A more complicated figure, a woman who had loved Charles genuinely and for a very long time, and who had pursued that love with a patience and a focus that Elizabeth in her private assessment respected, even while she understood exactly what that pursuit had cost Diana. She said that her concern about Camilla's position going forward was not personal, it was institutional. She said that the institution had made a choice in rehabilitating Camilla and placing her beside Charles at the coronation and giving her the title and the seat and the ceremonial weight of the position. The choice had been operationally necessary. Charles needed a partner. The institution needed stability. The rehabilitation had been the most workable path available through an extraordinarily difficult situation, but the choice had consequences that the institution had not been honest about publicly, and that she believed needed to be addressed honestly in the reign that followed. The consequences were these. The rehabilitation had been presented publicly as a resolution, as the institution moving forward from Diana's story into a new chapter. But a resolution requires that the underlying question be answered, and Elizabeth, in her private assessment, did not believe the underlying question had been answered. The underlying question was this: what did the institution owe Diana's memory in the way it handled the woman whose relationship with Charles had been at the center of Diana's documented suffering? The rehabilitation had managed that question. It had not answered it. Elizabeth believed that William's reign would eventually require an answer rather than continued management. Not a dramatic public reckoning, not an institutional statement that named Camilla's role in Diana's suffering in the explicit terms that would damage Charles and destabilize the transition. Something more subtle and more durable than that. A gradual, honest redistribution of the institutional weight that the rehabilitation had placed around Camilla's position. A quiet return of symbolic authority, of ceremonial precedence, of institutional proximity, toward the things Diana had stood for and the people who carried her forward, rather than toward the people most associated with what she had suffered. Elizabeth said she believed William understood this already. She said she believed Anne understood it. She said she believed Catherine embodied it in ways that would become more visible as her position grew. What she was not certain of was whether the institutional mechanisms existed to make it happen without someone having the specific private conversation that gave it direction. She was having that conversation now, with the person she trusted to ensure that the direction reached the people who needed to receive it. After speaking about Diana, and about Camilla. Elizabeth turned the conversation to William, not in the way that a grandmother speaks about a grandchild she loves. In the way that a monarch speaks about a successor she has observed carefully across their entire adult life and has formed a specific honest assessment of. She said that William was the most prepared person who had ever waited to be king in the modern history of the monarchy, not in the ceremonial sense, in the sense of having understood what the role actually required, rather than what its surface demanded. Having watched the institution's failures across his lifetime, and having formed his own honest conclusions about what needed to be different, rather than simply accepting what the institution told him it was. She said that this specific quality was the most valuable thing the monarchy had going forward, more valuable than public approval, which fluctuated, more valuable than constitutional stability, which was structural rather than dependent on individual character. More valuable than anything the institution could provide through its formal preparation of heirs for succession. The honest private understanding of what the institution needed to become, combined with the willingness to act on that understanding. She said she had not always understood William's approach while she was alive to observe it directly. There had been moments when his deliberateness had read to her as hesitation, when his precision had looked like caution rather than judgment, when his patience had seemed like unwillingness to act rather than the specific timing of someone who understood that the right moment for an action mattered as much as the action itself. She said she had come to understand, in the years before her death, that she had been misreading those qualities. The deliberateness was preparation. The precision was respect for what he was dealing with. The patience was the specific patience of someone who intended to act, but who understood that acting before the ground was prepared produced outcomes that prepared action did not. She said she trusted him, with a specificity and a weight that the people familiar with the account of that conversation describe as unlike anything Elizabeth was ordinarily willing to say about trust in any private context. She trusted him to know when to act on what she had said about Camilla. She trusted him to do it in the way that served the institution's honest future rather than any individual's immediate comfort or discomfort. She trusted him to understand that what she was asking for was not revenge and not punishment and not any of the personal satisfactions that a simpler reading of the Diana story might have made appealing. She was asking for honesty, the specific institutional honesty that the monarchy owed Diana's memory, expressed in the gradual quiet redistribution of weight and authority and symbolic precedence that only the person who controlled the institution's future could produce. She trusted William to produce it. Subscribe to Palace Drop right now and hit the bell. This is the channel that maps the complete story behind every decision being made inside that palace. Every week, every video. Subscribe now so you never miss what is coming next. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. When it reached its natural conclusion, Elizabeth did not summarize what she had said or ask for any commitment about how it would be used. She did not give the person she had chosen any specific instruction about who to tell or when or how. She trusted them to know. That trust was itself the final communication of the conversation. A woman who had managed information with extraordinary precision across 70 years of reign, choosing at the end of that reign to transmit the most important private guidance she had left to give, through trust rather than through instruction. The person she had chosen sat with everything they had heard for a moment before leaving. Then they told Elizabeth that they understood. Elizabeth looked at them for a moment. Then she nodded once. The conversation was over. She did not speak about Camilla again in the weeks that remained. Not because the subject was exhausted or because she had reconsidered what she had said. The people who were with her in those final weeks describe a woman who had the specific quality of someone who has completed something important and who has moved their attention fully to what remains rather than returning to what is done. She had said what needed to be said, to the right person, at the right time. The rest was not hers to manage. The person Elizabeth had chosen did not go directly to William. They understood, from everything they knew about how Elizabeth had operated and from the specific quality of what she had said, that going directly to William immediately after the conversation would have been the wrong use of what they had been given. Elizabeth had not arranged the conversation to generate a briefing. She had arranged it to ensure that the guidance existed in a form that could reach William at the right moment, rather than simply the earliest available moment. They waited. They were present in the months that followed Elizabeth's death, as the institution navigated the transition of reign, and the accession, and the coronation, and the early establishment of Charles's court. They observed. They noted the moments when what Elizabeth had said became relevant to what they were watching. They assessed whether William's own understanding of his situation was moving in the direction Elizabeth had trusted it would move. It was. Not because of anything the person had said or done, because William had arrived at his own honest understanding of what the institution required, in ways that reflected the qualities Elizabeth had identified in him, without ever having been told what Elizabeth had said about those qualities. When the moment arrived that felt right for transmitting what Elizabeth had said, the transmission happened in the specific, quiet way that the most important private communications inside the royal family have always happened. Not dramatically, not with any formal ceremony or official context, in a private conversation between people who trusted each other, in a setting where what was said could be received fully rather than partially. William heard what Elizabeth had said in that final conversation. He sat with it. He did not speak about it immediately to anyone who was present. He added it to the honest private understanding of his situation that he had been building across his adult life. And in the months and years that followed, he acted on it. In the duchy decisions, in the Tuesday meeting, in the specific shape of everything that has happened to Camilla's institutional position since the death of the woman who had spent 70 years managing what honesty required, and who had decided in the end that the most important thing she could do with the time she had left was to say what honest required, rather than manage it. In the final weeks of her life, Queen Elizabeth arranged a private conversation that lasted nearly an hour. She spoke about Diana, with the honesty of someone who had moved beyond the need to manage the impression she created and was simply saying what she actually believed. She spoke about Camilla with the complexity that the simplest version of the public narrative had never captured, and with the institutional honesty that the management of Camilla's rehabilitation had never required her to express publicly. She spoke about William with the trust of a monarch who had watched a successor across their entire adult life and had reached a specific, honest conclusion about what they were capable of and what they would do with that capability. Then she nodded once, and she turned her attention to what remained. The conversation she had arranged in those final weeks did not appear in any official record. It was not entered into any institutional archive. It was not referenced in any public statement about her final months. It was simply a conversation between a queen who had managed the most complicated institutional balance in modern royal history for 70 years, and who had decided at the end of it that management was no longer what the situation required, and the person she trusted to ensure that what she had finally said reached the person who needed to hear it. William heard it. He understood it. And everything that has happened inside the British monarchy since reflects the specific, honest guidance of a woman who spent 70 years knowing what needed to be said, and who waited until the very end to finally say it. Because some things are only right to say when you are certain of the person who will receive them. Elizabeth was certain of William. She said it. And the institution has been moving in the direction she pointed ever since. Subscribe to Palace Up and hit the bell. Every week we go deeper on the stories the palace does not want mapped. The palace has a version of every story. This is the other one. There is one detail from that final conversation that has not yet been told. Near the end of the hour, after Elizabeth had said everything she needed to say about Diana and Camilla and William, she said something about one other person, someone whose role in the story she believed had not been fully understood by anyone inside the institution. Someone whose specific position gave them an influence over what came next that Elizabeth believed was both more significant and more complicated than it appeared. She named that person. She said what she believed about them. And the person she had chosen for the conversation has been carrying that specific detail in the same careful silence as everything else Elizabeth said. Who Elizabeth named and what she said about them is the story coming next to this channel. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you are here when it drops.